Owen and Caleb were born 3 minutes apart. But to them, time had never mattered. From their very first breath, they were two sides of the same coin, two halves of a whole. Their parents often joked that the boys lived in their own world, speaking a language no one else could understand. Growing up, they were inseparable. They climbed trees in the backyard, their laughter echoing in the quiet suburb where they lived. They built forts out of old sheets, whispering secrets long after their parents thought they'd fallen asleep. While other siblings fought over toys and space, Owen and Caleb found comfort in each other's presence. They were brothers, best friends, and in many ways, soulmates. Their connection went beyond words. If Owen scraped his knee, Caleb would wince as if he felt the sting himself. If Caleb laughed, Owen joined in without knowing why, their joy rippling through each other like waves on a still lake. But things began to change as they grew older. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the simplicity of their bond gave way to something more complicated. It started with fleeting moments, a glance that lingered too long, a smile that felt heavier than it should. Caleb, always the bolder of the two, was the first to notice. One autumn evening, after a long day of school, the twins sprawled on their respective beds. The soft hum of the ceiling fan filled the room, blending with the faint rustle of leaves outside. Caleb broke the silence. "Do you think anyone else feels like us?" he asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. Owen turned his head, frowning slightly. "Feels like what? I don't know," Caleb admitted, hesitating. "This close, like we are." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Owen felt his heart race, a wave of unease tightening his chest. He didn't know how to respond, didn't even fully understand what Caleb meant. Or maybe he did, and that was what scared him. "I guess not everyone has what we have," Owen finally murmured, his voice barely audible. Caleb looked over at him, his dark eyes soft but searching. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I guess not." The moment passed, but it left a weight in the room that neither of them could shake. The hum of the fan returned to fill the silence. But Owen couldn't stop replaying Caleb's words in his mind. They stirred something deep inside him, something he couldn't name. As he stared at the ceiling that night, sleep eluded him. For the first time, Owen felt the fragile foundation of their bond shift beneath his feet. In the weeks that followed, the air between Owen and Caleb grew heavier, as if Caleb's question had unlocked a door they weren't ready to walk through. Their once effortless bond now felt strained, laced with a tension neither dared to name. Owen began to notice things he never paid attention to before. The way Caleb's laughter seemed to light up the entire room. How his smile could make Owen's chest feel tight, like something was pressing down on it. These weren't the feelings he was supposed to have. Not for Caleb, not for his twin. He found himself pulling away, retreating into himself in a desperate attempt to silence the thoughts swirling in his head. At school, he avoided Caleb between classes. At home, he lingered in the kitchen or stayed in his room, pretending to be busy with homework. It was easier that way, or so he told himself. Caleb, on the other hand, was growing frustrated. He'd always been the one to bring them back together when life pulled them apart. But this time, Owen felt out of reach. He didn't understand why his brother, his other half, was shutting him out. One Friday evening, their parents went out for dinner, leaving the house to the twins. The familiar routine of pizza and a movie played out in the living room. But tonight, something felt different. The glow of the television bathed the room in flickering light, but the silence between them was louder than the explosions on the screen. Owen sat on one end of the couch, pretending to watch the movie, while Caleb sprawled on the other, his legs lazily stretched out. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. Owen shrugged, not trusting himself to say much. "Just tired, I guess." "Liar." Caleb grinned, but his eyes betrayed something else: concern, curiosity, something deeper. "I know when something's on your mind. Spill it." "There's nothing to spill," Owen muttered, but his heart was pounding. He could feel Caleb's gaze on him, unrelenting and probing. Caleb sat up straighter, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You've been avoiding me," he said bluntly. "Why?" "I haven't been," Owen started, but the lie caught in his throat. He sighed, raking a hand through his hair. "I'm not avoiding you, Caleb. I don't know." "That's not an answer." Caleb's voice softened, but his persistence didn't waver. "Come on, it's me. You can tell me anything." Owen wanted to. God, he wanted to. But how could he put into words the storm raging inside him? How could he tell Caleb that the way he looked at him sometimes made Owen forget how to breathe? That the thought of losing what they had scared him more than anything? It's nothing, Owen said finally, forcing a smile he didn't feel. I promise. Caleb didn't look convinced, but he let it drop. Leaning back against the couch with a sigh, he stretched out again. Okay, he said, his voice light but tinged with something else. Disappointment. Hurt. But you know I'm here. Right? For whatever. Always. Owen nodded, his throat tight. Yeah, he whispered. I know. The movie continued, but Owen barely registered it. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in thoughts and feelings he couldn't untangle. And then it happened. Caleb's foot brushed against his. Not on purpose, but not entirely by accident either. The touch was innocent, casual, but it lingered just a second too long. Owen's breath hitched. His entire body froze. He could feel the warmth of Caleb's skin, even through the fabric of his jeans. Sorry, Caleb said quickly, pulling his foot back, but there was something in his voice. Something that made Owen look at him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. It was just the two of them, suspended in a moment that neither of them dared to break. Caleb's gaze softened, and Owen felt his heart race. He wanted to say something, to laugh it off, to do anything to break the tension. But he couldn't move, he couldn't breathe. And then Caleb smiled, a small, hesitant smile that sent a shiver down Owen's spine. I mean it, Caleb said softly. Whatever it is, you can tell me. Owen looked away, his chest tightening. He couldn't, not yet. But in that moment, he realized something he couldn't ignore. He was falling. And there was no going back. The following days passed in a blur. But the weight of that moment on the couch lingered between them like an unspoken secret. Owen found himself replaying it over and over, Caleb's touch, his soft smile, and the quiet invitation in his words. It haunted him, pulling at the edges of his thoughts, no matter how hard he tried to bury it. By Friday evening, the tension in the air was unbearable. Their parents were out again, and the house was still. Save for the distant hum of the fridge, Owen had retreated to their shared room, staring blankly at a textbook he wasn't reading. The numbers and words blurred on the page. His mind tangled in a mess of emotions he couldn't untangle. He didn't hear Caleb enter until his voice broke the silence. Are you going to tell me what's going on? Or am I supposed to guess? Caleb asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. His tone was light, but there was an edge to it. A quiet insistence that Owen couldn't ignore. Owen didn't look up. There's nothing to tell, he muttered, his voice flat. Caleb stepped closer, his footsteps soft on the carpet. Owen, come on. You've been acting weird for weeks. You barely talk to me. You avoid eye contact. And every time I get near you, you look like you're about to crawl out of your skin. Owen's jaw tightened. I don't know what you're talking about. Caleb let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. Why can't you just talk to me? I'm your brother. Owen, I'm supposed to be the one person you can trust. That's the problem. Owen's voice came out louder than he intended, startling them both. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he turned away. His face burned, and his hands trembled, but he couldn't stop now. The words were tumbling out before he could hold them back. You're my brother, Caleb. That's why I can't. His voice cracked, and he turned away, his back to Caleb, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breathing. But the weight of what he just said pressed down on him like a storm cloud. There was a long, painful silence. Owen expected Caleb to walk away, to leave the room and pretend this conversation had never happened. But instead, Caleb's voice came soft and steady. Owen, he said, his name with a gentleness that made Owen's chest ache. Look at me. I can't. Owen whispered, his voice breaking. Please, Caleb, just don't. Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper but filled with something that stopped Owen in his tracks. Slowly, reluctantly, Owen turned around. Caleb was standing just a few steps away. His dark eyes locked on Owen's with an intensity that made Owen's heart pound. There was something in Caleb's gaze. Something raw and vulnerable and terrifying. Understanding. Fear. Hope. It was all there, tangled together in a way that made Owen's knees weak. You think I don't feel it too? Caleb said quietly, his voice steady but his hands trembling at his sides. You think I haven't been going crazy trying to figure out what's wrong with me? Why I can't stop thinking about you? Owen froze, his breath catching in his throat. The words didn't make sense. Or maybe they made too much sense. His mind raced, trying to process what Caleb was saying. But his heart was already ahead of him, pounding in his chest like it wanted to burst. Caleb. Owen's voice trembled, barely audible. Caleb stepped closer, closing the small distance between them. I don't know what it means. And I don't know what to do about it, he said, his voice low and filled with emotion. But I know one thing. I'm tired of pretending it's not there. Owen felt like the ground was slipping out from under him. He wanted to run, to hide, to push Caleb away and bury the truth deep inside where no one could find it. But he couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure Caleb could hear it. I can't lose you, Owen whispered, his voice breaking. No matter what, I can't lose you. You won't. Caleb's voice was firm, but his eyes softened as he reached out, his hand resting gently on Owen's shoulder. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out together. Owen stared at him, his chest tight and his mind racing. He wanted to believe him, to trust that they could navigate this impossible situation without falling apart. But the fear was still there, clawing at him, threatening to pull him under. Okay, Owen said finally, his voice shaky but steady enough. But not here, not now. Caleb nodded, his hand lingering on Owen's shoulder for a moment longer before dropping away. Whenever you're ready, he said softly. Owen looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something he hadn't allowed himself to see before. It wasn't just the bond they'd always shared. It was something deeper, something terrifying, and something he couldn't deny any longer. As Caleb turned to leave, Owen sat down heavily on the edge of his bed, his thoughts a chaotic mess. He knew one thing for certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The next day felt like an eternity. Owen couldn't shake the memory of the night before, the intensity of Caleb's words, the way his touch lingered like a promise. It gnawed at him, pulling at every corner of his mind. By the time evening arrived, Owen couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his hoodie and slipped out the back door, heading for the trail behind their house. It was a familiar path, one they'd walked 1,000 times before. But tonight it felt different. The cold air nipped at his face, and the crunch of leaves beneath his shoes was the only sound in the stillness. He hadn't expected Caleb to follow him. You're just going to leave without saying anything? Caleb's voice cut through the quiet, startling Owen. He stopped in his tracks but didn't turn around. The sound of Caleb's footsteps grew closer, the leaves crunching underfoot as he caught up. Go back inside, Owen muttered, stuffing his hands into his hoodie pockets. I need to be alone. You don't get to do this, Caleb said firmly, stepping in front of Owen and forcing him to stop. His eyes were dark and tense, but there was no anger in them, just concern, just hurt. You don't get to walk away and shut me out like this. I'm not shutting you out, Owen snapped, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. He sighed, looking away. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything, just talk to me. Caleb's voice softened, his frustration giving way to something gentler. I'm not going anywhere, Owen, you know that. Owen's throat tightened, his chest aching with the weight of it all. He didn't know how to explain what he was feeling, didn't even know if he could. But Caleb's unwavering gaze demanded honesty, and Owen couldn't bring himself to lie anymore. That's the problem, Owen whispered, his voice barely audible. You're always here, Caleb, you're always everything. Caleb blinked, his expression shifting as the meaning of Owen's words sank in. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at Owen with a mixture of understanding and disbelief. You think I don't feel it too? Caleb asked quietly, his voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. You think I haven't been losing my mind trying to figure out why I feel this way about you? Owen froze, his breath catching in his throat. He'd been so consumed by his own turmoil that he hadn't allowed himself to imagine Caleb might be feeling the same thing. And yet, here they were, standing face to face in the quiet woods. The truth laid bare between them. Caleb, Owen's voice broke, and he shook his head. This isn't right. We can't. Why not? Caleb interrupted, his tone sharper now. Because people would say it's wrong. Because we're not supposed to feel this way. Owen, I don't care what anyone else thinks. I care about you. Owen's chest tightened, the weight of Caleb's words pressing down on him. He wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that they could hold on to what they had without it destroying them. But the fear was still there, clawing at him, refusing to let go. "I don't want to lose you," Owen whispered, his voice trembling. "No matter what, I can't lose you." "You won't," Caleb said, stepping closer. His hand brushed against Owen's. A small, tentative touch that sent a jolt through Owen's entire body. "We're in this together. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out." Owen stared at him, his heart pounding, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of something other than fear. Hope. Tentative, fragile hope. The woods around them seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them standing there, suspended in the moment. Caleb's eyes held a quiet determination, a promise that Owen desperately wanted to believe. "Okay," Owen said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But this doesn't mean I'm not scared." Caleb nodded, his expression softening. "Me too," he admitted, "but I'm not letting that stop me." As they turned and headed back toward the house, the silence between them felt different, lighter, less oppressive. Owen still didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, he didn't feel entirely alone in facing it. The days that followed were filled with an unspoken tension, a delicate balance between the familiar and the new. Owen and Caleb moved around each other like planets in orbit, close but careful never to collide. Their bond, once effortless, now carried a weight that neither of them could deny. At family dinners, they laughed and joked like nothing had changed, their parents none the wiser. Around friends, they kept their distance, their interactions carefully measured. But when they were alone, the walls came down, and the truth lingered in the space between them. One quiet evening, long after the rest of the house had fallen asleep, Owen sat alone in their shared room. The dim light from his bedside lamp cast soft shadows on the walls as he stared at a book he wasn't reading. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in thoughts and emotions he couldn't unravel. The door creaked open, and Caleb stepped inside, closing it quietly behind him. He didn't say anything at first, just crossed the room and sat on the edge of Owen's bed. Close enough that their knees almost touched. Close enough that Owen could feel the warmth of his presence. "Can't sleep?" Caleb asked, his voice soft. Owen shook his head. "You neither?" Caleb hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking." Owen's hands tightened around the book. He didn't need to ask what Caleb had been thinking about, he already knew. "About what?" he asked anyway, his voice barely audible. Caleb didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against Owen's. The touch was so small, so hesitant, but it sent a jolt through Owen like electricity. "About us," Caleb said finally, his voice steady but quiet. "About what this means." Owen swallowed hard, his chest tightening. "Caleb, we shouldn't." "Don't," Caleb interrupted gently. "Don't tell me we shouldn't feel this. Because I do. I can't stop thinking about it. About you." Owen looked up, meeting Caleb's eyes for the first time. There was something raw and vulnerable in his gaze. Something that made Owen's breath catch in his throat. He wanted to deny it. To push Caleb away. To protect the fragile bond they'd always shared. But he couldn't. Not when Caleb was looking at him like that. "This is wrong," Owen whispered, his voice trembling. "It has to be." "Maybe it is," Caleb admitted, his tone unwavering. "Maybe it's the worst thing we could ever feel. But it doesn't change the fact that I feel it. And I think you do too." Owen's heart raced, his mind screaming at him to pull away, to put an end to this before it went any further. But his body refused to listen. The warmth of Caleb's touch, the quiet intensity in his voice, it felt right in a way that terrified him. "I don't know what to do," Owen admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to." Before he could finish, Caleb leaned in, slowly, tentatively, giving Owen every chance to pull away. But he didn't. He couldn't. When their lips met, it was soft and hesitant, like testing the waters of something uncharted. Owen's heart pounded in his chest, his mind screaming at him to stop. But his body stayed rooted in the moment. The warmth of Caleb's touch, the softness of his lips, it overwhelmed everything else. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, their foreheads rested together, the room silent except for the sound of their uneven breathing. "This changes everything," Owen whispered, his voice barely audible. "I know," Caleb said, his hand still resting on Owen's. "But I don't care." Owen closed his eyes, his chest tight with emotions he couldn't contain. He didn't have the answers, didn't know what the future would hold. But in that moment, with Caleb so close, he knew one thing for sure: he didn't want to let go. The days that followed were unlike anything Owen and Caleb had ever experienced. Their connection, once simple and natural, now carried an intensity that neither could ignore. Every glance, every touch felt magnified, charged with meaning. The world outside remained oblivious, but their private universe had shifted irrevocably. They were careful, always careful. At family dinners, they made sure their interactions appeared casual, their banter unchanged. Around friends, they kept a safe distance, their hands shoved into their pockets to resist the urge to linger too long in each other's presence. But when they were alone, the barriers they put up crumbled. One evening, while the rest of the house was quiet, they found themselves in the kitchen. The soft glow of the refrigerator light illuminated the room as they stood side by side. Owen reached for the carton of milk at the same time as Caleb, their fingers brushing briefly. "Sorry," Owen said quickly, pulling his hand back, his face burning. But Caleb's small, teasing smile stopped him. "Why are you apologizing?" Caleb asked, his voice low. "It's just me, that's why," Owen said softly, his eyes fixed on the counter. Caleb set the carton down and stepped closer, closing the small distance between them. His dark eyes searched Owen's face, his expression steady but tender. "You don't have to be afraid with me," he said. "You know that, right?" Owen nodded, but the knot in his stomach didn't loosen. "It's not just about us," he said, his voice trembling. "If anyone finds out, they won't. This is ours." "Owen," Caleb interrupted, his voice firm. "No one else's." Owen looked at him, his chest tightening. He wanted to believe him, to trust that they could keep their secret safe. But the fear was always there, lurking at the edge of his mind. Later that night, as they sat together on the couch in the dimly lit living room, the world outside seemed to fade away. Caleb leaned back, one arm draped casually along the back of the couch, the other resting lightly on Owen's hand. The soft flicker of the television bathed them in a pale glow. But neither of them was paying attention to the screen. "Do you ever think about what it would be like if things were different?" Owen asked, his voice breaking the silence. Caleb glanced at him, his thumb brushing against Owen's hand in a small, comforting gesture. "Like how? If we didn't have to hide," Owen said, his gaze stayed fixed on their hands, afraid to meet Caleb's eyes. "If we could just be." Caleb sighed, his grip tightening around Owen's hand. "I think about it all the time," he admitted, "but this is our reality. It's not fair, but it's what we've got." Owen looked up, meeting Caleb's gaze. There was sadness in his eyes, but also a quiet determination that made Owen's chest ache. Caleb wasn't giving up, not on them, not on this. And for the first time, Owen let himself hope that maybe, just maybe, they could hold on to what they had. "We'll figure it out," Caleb said, his voice soft but firm. "Whatever it takes." Owen nodded, his chest tight. He wanted to believe him, to trust that they could keep their secret without losing themselves in the process. And as Caleb leaned in, their foreheads touching, Owen felt a flicker of hope. "We've got this," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible. "I promise." Owen closed his eyes, letting himself believe it. In that moment, with Caleb so close, the weight of the world didn't feel so heavy. For now, it was enough. Thanks for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deeply personal and thought-provoking tales. Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your perspective. See you in the next story.